With this video, we are going to combine the indicators of 814 and 815 because a lot of these concepts overlap when you're talking about the growth of Carolina, specifically South Carolina as a colony. And so we're just going to discuss these elements together. So we're going to begin just with a refresher on what the two main cash crops were for South Carolina. We have rice and we have indigo. And then let's talk about the first slaves. It says, of course, the first slaves of South Carolina were American Indians. You have the drawbacks, of course, because the males didn't really know how to cultivate the land, but they did know the layout of the land well enough to easily escape. And so when you take those factors in combination with how disease basically decimated the population, you definitely needed to get a different labor source if you were these lords proprietors that we talked about earlier. Now, whenever you think about African slavery before cash crops, they were needing people to do the labor. Even though it wasn't quite so difficult, you would often see masters, quote-unquote masters, and these slaves side by side working until these cash crops came over. Just because it was a difficult job and it was difficult to find the labor. So once these people came from Barbados, these English settlers came from Barbados, it helped to establish not only the plantation system, but just to have that labor, that human resource available. Now, in reference to Carolina gold, you're talking about rice. And so the first rich planters, you're talking about the settlers that they invited in with these lords proprietors. They came from Barbados. They were English settlers who had established settler colonies there, and they came from Barbados, and they brought with them two things. One, of course, was rice as a cash crop, and then the plantation system. The people of this area with Barbados, they had this expertise in rice cultivation. And so they had this experience. They knew how to work the land and just to do it most effectively and efficiently. And so Barbados, of course, was one of these proprietary colonies owned like a business in the same aspect. And so that's why earlier we talked about how you could begin to see how South Carolina was a colony of a colony. With that initial colony, of course, I'm referring to Barbados. And just a little tidbit thrown in, Barbados was actually still owned by Great Britain until about around the 1960s, whenever they won their own independence. When you talk about indigo coming to South Carolina, you should automatically think of the name Eliza Lucas Pinckney. And she was the one who brought indigo to South Carolina. Just an interesting story about her. She's actually in South Carolina's Business Hall of Fame. She was born on a plantation. Unlike most females of her time, she was actually given an education. Her dad saw just this different thing within her, and so just offered her that opportunity for an education. And so as Spain and England just began to fight over land, and you had all of this, just erupting throughout the world, her father felt it was safer to basically move his family to South Carolina. And so she shared this knowledge that she had with other South Carolina plantation owners, and she enabled this cash crop of indigo to become the second largest cash crop in South Carolina. Now, there were tensions that were caused by, if you think about just rice and indigo, and when you're talking about tension, you're talking about conflict. And a basic history theme throughout, of course, is that conflict leads to change. You see that over and over again throughout history. And so working on these plantations, of course, was very labor intensive, and it required extremely hard work by slaves. It was year round as far as cultivation goes, and so they were expected to work extremely hard. And so that led to conflicts of slavery. If you think about the forced migration of these people coming to this area against their will, this forced labor, this population imbalance, and so that's going to lead to rebellions. And the main one that you need to know as far as this point in history was South Carolina. You're talking about the Stono Rebellion. Now, let's just quickly talk about what we mean by resources. At this time, you can think of resources as being three basic things. It's either going to be a natural resource, which is something that's found naturally within the environment, geography or climate. You're talking about human resources, which of course are human beings, and then political resources, which refer to government policies and such. So whenever you think about a natural resource, think about rice. Human resources as slaves, political resources like the headright system, mercantilism, just those sorts of things. Now, whenever you think about the geography and climate of South Carolina, we know that they had fertile lands, long growing seasons, dense forests. And so I want you to think about this particular question. How did South Carolina use these resources to make money? Well, of course, they sold timber. And then for the most part, South Carolina would use the fertile land to grow these cash crops, such as rice and indigo, for profit. Now, I want you to think about this. Is this natural, human, or political resources used? This, of course, is going to be natural, and you can read why. All right, when we're talking about Barbados, there's this unique relationship between South Carolina and Barbados because you had these wealthy plantation owners that moved over from this location. There was the drawing up of the fundamental constitutions of the Carolinas, which of course was the idea of the Lord's proprietors. And then with these slaves coming over, with these plantation owners in this plantation system, there was the first slaves that came over, as well as just slave codes that we're going to learn about in just a moment. But you may ask the question, how did South Carolina use these resources to make money? Well, South Carolina's first plantation owners from Barbados brought the slaves with them, these slave codes, and also the plantation system. Slaves were used as the labor force to grow these cash crops just because of their experience, especially with rice and connection to Barbados, as well as cotton. And then a few South Carolina settlers also sold cattle and Native American slaves to Barbados. So I want you to think about this. Is this human? Is this natural? Or is this political? Of course, you can see it's human, and this is how. Now, whenever you talk about slavery, you're talking about slavery in the plantation systems in reference to the southern colonies, just like South Carolina. And they used the slave labor to grow the cash crops on these huge plantations. Now, African slaves replaced the Native American slaves and indentured servants as a cheap source of labor. Basically, they were getting all the profit. They weren't paying these people. They didn't treat them as indentured servants as far as giving up any of their land or any of their the wealth from the crops that they were growing. And so it was just a lot more strenuous and difficult for these slaves specifically because unlike the Native Americans, they did not have the chance to escape. I want you to think about this. How did South Carolina use the resources to make money? Everything we just talked about. So is this natural, human, or political resources? Of course, this is human. Then you talk about mercantilism. And this is a concept, of course, that you focused on in 7th grade as well. But it's just a government policy where you have a mother country and it's controlling the trade of its colony. So basically, your colony can only sell to the mother country and they can only buy from the mother country. Even though the mother countries could, of course, trade with one another, this was just a way to have that almost like a child-parent relationship where you are getting all of the benefits of your colony. So if you think about the raw materials that they made into finished products, those keywords that you used last year, that's what mercantilism has to do with. So how did South Carolina use this resource to make money? Well, of course, there were the cash crops that were sent back to England. If you think about rice and indigo, England gave out subsidies or the bonuses for growing rice and indigo, and then this triangular trade route that was happening guaranteed that there would be new slaves coming into this area. So is this natural, human, or political, and why? This is political. Mercantilism is political. you have the African contributions and the Stoner Rebellion with your next indicator. With African Americans and their role in the South Carolina economy, of course, slaves were brought from Barbados or the Middle Passage from Africa and then sold. The plantation system depended on this slave labor and was growing with the development of the cash crops. And of course, slaves are the ones who cultivated these cash crops and even harvested the lumber for trade with Great Britain, those raw materials turning into finished goods. But slaves brought with them something very unique, even to South Carolina. If you think about the Gullah culture, and there's a video that you're going to watch later on specifically about this, but whenever you think about, like even especially like in the Low Country, like the Charleston area, Gullah is just one of those cultural words that is still very much celebrated today. And you're talking about the language, dance, music, wood carving, folk medicine, basket weaving. That's your Gullah culture. So Gullah was a spoken language of Africans that developed off the coast of South Carolina. Was a mixture of these many languages of these different people from these different places combined with newly created words. Just quickly about the Stoner Rebellion, I'm just going to read this and you can simply fill in the blanks. The flourishing slave trade created a population imbalance, more slaves than plantation owners. Slaves outnumbered whites, and this raised concern about controlling the slave population. So the Stoner Rebellion was a slave revolt near Charlestown or Charleston. It significantly increased this concern. And it started when a small group of slaves who wanted to escape to St. Augustine, Florida, where the Spanish said, hey, we're going to set you free. They would be free if they went to this area. And so these slaves broke into a store on the Stoner River and they killed 2 settlers. And by the end of the day, many settlers and slaves were killed. And so as a result of the Stoner Rebellion, slave codes developed. And of course, this was something that also came from Barbados. Although slave codes also punished slave owners who were cruel to their slaves, what was most important to the colonists is that it established a tighter control of their slaves. So one example was that these slaves could not hold a meeting without permission from their owners. They couldn't even leave the plantation, of course, without permission because they were considered to be property. So you can begin to see almost like a cause and effect. When the slaves rebelled with this Stoner Rebellion, you can begin to see what happened. It says as tensions increased, tensions that caused slaves to rebel in South Carolina. You think about the cruelty, the forced migration, because it was so labor intensive, and then you see what the results of that were. And then again, with the slave codes, you can begin to see how it only increased the racial tensions. So you had these laws that were so cruel and demeaning, and how it only caused these tensions to get worse. So what you're going to do is just to answer a series of questions. This was actually, you can consider this to be a primary source because it was taken from a newspaper, an account of the Stoner Rebellion. You're going to answer some basic questions. One is, what do you see? Another is, what type of person do you think the author was? A third, what type of person do you think the audience was? And how does this show bias?